Hi. So, uh, I got asked a question this week by a colleague of mine who is experiencing a lot of stress, has been experiencing a lot of stress over the last several months. And for whatever reason, I tend to be the person that people come to talk to about certain things. And she's definitely someone who confides in me a lot about some of the issues that she's running into. And she's been struggling with stress, anxiety, sadness, and just an overall feeling of lack of security in her current situation. And she asked me the question after she talked to me for a while about a lot of the stuff that she's going through. And she asked me, how do we practice Buddhism? How do you practice Buddhism? And she knows that I'm training to become a priest and that I've been practicing for a while. So I think she just kind of brought me this question because she's looking for some peace for herself. And she explained to me that she was really thinking that the reason she was feeling so unhappy was that, some of it was due to a lack of a spiritual practice. And this question really threw me for a loop because I didn't know how to answer that question. How do I practice Buddhism? Like, how do we practice it? It's sounds like such a simple question. It's something that should be easy for someone to answer, especially if you've been practicing for a while. But really, I think the answer is incredibly complex. I didn't know how to deal with it. And in that moment, my mind went completely blank because I knew what her real concern was just wrestling with a lot of just being all up here, thinking, as Susan would say. Um, so what I did was I pointed her to an app that I really like. It's called Plum Village, and it's got a lot of really great resources in it. And I, explained to her, that it might be nice to start with some guided meditations because the Plum Village app has some really nice short, like 2, 3, 4, 5 minute guided meditations. And there's also Dharma talks in there that she could, listen to if she wanted to, if she really was looking for actually Buddhism. There were some Dharma talks in there that she could listen to that are really appropriate for people who are just starting out. So I pointed her to that because I really just didn't know what else to say in that moment. But the question really stuck with me. I think I was bothered by the fact that I kind of couldn't come up with a nice, quick, pithy answer. So I kind of mulled that over. Like, how do we practice Buddhism? How do I practice it? And there's just so much to it that I couldn't come up with just a nice short answer. Um, but then, after a bit, I came across another question. Why practice Buddhism? And for me, that was like, oh, well, I think that's kind of how I can find my answers if I look at why I practice Buddhism. Um, so I started thinking about that. I came to Buddhism the way a lot of people, I think, come to their spiritual practices. And I was looking for something, that something bigger than myself. And just because of my upbringing, I had early exposure to some Buddhist ideas and thoughts through children's stories and things. Uh, but it was really when I was in my 20s, early 20s, that I kind of had this curiosity for the actual religion. Um, but I didn't really have the drive to find a practice until my life became very heavy feeling. And at the time that I really started to look for Buddhism as an answer to some of my stuff, I was raising two kids of my own. Um, my husband at the time was actively an alcoholic. Thankfully, he's in recovery now. But I worked full time. I basically ran the house on my own. I did all the things to help my kids have as normal of a life as possible, while my husband was very absent from our lives. His body was in the house, but the rest of him really just wasn't. We really never saw him. It was pretty rare that we actually saw him. Um, I remember crying myself to sleep a lot of the times because I was exhausted from doing everything by myself. I was frustrated, I was angry, I was lonely, and I was afraid. I was afraid for this person that I cared about who was doing so much damage to himself. I didn't know how to help him. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know how to make it better. It was a really rough place to be. And I also was doing a lot of enabling and denying and lying to people around me so that they didn't know what was happening, because I was also very ashamed and embarrassed about our lives at that time. It was really hard. It was a hard, dark, dark time. And I was looking for something to help me find strength in the situation that I was in. Long story short, I found an online group that practiced Buddhism, and we studied together. We would do book studies. And in that group and in those studies and what we read, I did find some solace. We read a book by Thich Nhat Hanh, and I wish I could remember what book it was, but that quote, "No mud, no lotus," really stuck out to me. And it really helped carry me through the dark moments in my life at that time. And I didn't fully understand the extent of the depth of the meaning of that quote, but what I really needed was that image of something good and beautiful rising out of the mud to give me hope. And I'm always very grateful for that. So meditation practice also helped. But having just that virtual Sangha also helped me find the teachings that gave me hope and started my journey toward grounding in just this moment, just this, which really made such a big difference, and seeing things as they truly are. My meditations and studies helped me part that veil of enabling and denial that continued the cycle of addiction for my husband. And the rest, as they say, is history. And my story isn't really unique. The Buddha himself suffered greatly in his life. And that is what caused him to search for a source of relief from what we would call his ignorance. And, he did grow up, they say a prince, but really the son of a chieftain of a village or a city. And he was isolated from the realities of life. When he was born, there were, oh gosh, I forget the title now of these people, but there was some people who said that the Buddha was destined for, and his name wasn't the Buddha, of course, his name was Siddhartha Gautama, and the father, Siddhartha's father, was told that this baby was destined for great things and that he would be either a great king or a great spiritual leader. And the father, of course, wanted Siddhartha to become a great king, to follow in his footsteps and bring his family, wealth and glory and all that. And he did everything he could to make sure that the Buddha was isolated from the realities of life so that he could become this king. He didn't know the realities of sickness, old age, and death, and which in and of itself really causes some suffering. If you think about kids who are brought up, what we would say spoiled or coddled, they're not happy people. They're really very unhappy. So, the Buddha did suffer at that. He did catch sight of evidence of these sufferings that are brought into that exist in the world, and he went on a search. We call it the going forth, and he suffered a lot. He gave up everything. He gave up his wife, his son, the palace that he lived in. He shed his clothing and took the clothing of a mendicant monk, and he led this really harsh existence. So he led a life of austerity, etc. Suffered a great deal. to the point where he's trying to overcome attachment to his body and hunger and things like that, and lost so much weight that they say that his stomach touched his back, that type of stuff, and really suffered a great deal in order to try to find his answers, his spiritual answers. All of that resulted in the end in his reaching enlightenment one day and getting a full understanding of the Dharma. So I think this just points to that idea that often when we're in the middle of some personally very challenging times, and when we are suffering a great deal in our day-to-day life, we do go on this search for answers. How do I alleviate the suffering that I'm experiencing? How do I help my husband who is hurting himself, and also us? How do I make the thing at work that doesn't make sense to me? How do I restore a sense of purpose in what I'm doing, etc.? How do I feel less lonely? How do I get to feel more connected? And on that search, if we're very lucky, we stumble on some answers that make sense to us, and from there we grow. And that's kind of what Buddhism was for me, definitely. So from there, that's the why. That's how I got started with Buddhism and how I found my way to it. And initially, I think we go into this practice for what might seem like self-serving reasons. At the beginning, it seems that way anyway. And, we're looking for answers to our big questions. We're looking for relief from our suffering and from our anxieties. And then what happens to me afterwards was that was the understanding as I practiced and I grew in my practice. I understood that while I found some relief for myself and some solace and some answers, none of them were to the questions that I was actually asking. Yet they somehow still helped me. And as I continued to practice, I came to realize that my job now was to also help others. So I helped myself, and now, I came to a place where I've got to help the people around me now. So helping myself was also helping others around me, and whether it was at home or at work, or when I picked up my grocery orders, as I was going shopping, it didn't matter. I was helping other people as best I could wherever I was. And the Buddha, of course, came to this as well, and of course in a much grander sense. his level of enlightenment and awakening was much deeper than anything any of us really get to experience. But once he found his answers, he now was called to help others by teaching them. And initially he didn't want to, of course. He believed that the Dharma would be too difficult for most people to understand, and that it wouldn't be a fruitful endeavor for him. And thankfully, though, we had a Brahma Sahampati who did convince him to teach, and so he did. And what I do doesn't really equate to teaching, and certainly not the way the Buddha did. It does resemble the help that the Buddha extended to those who needed it. Whether we're talking about giving a talk or simply practicing compassion towards those who many found difficult to feel compassion for, the Buddha took what he learned to extend help to everybody around him who needed it. And best of all, he did it in the way that suited the needs of the individuals that he met along the way. So the question then is, how does this lead up to, well, how do you practice Buddhism? So all of this leads me to the answer that I would give now to that question, right? So I think Buddhism is simply experiencing life as it is. So that's kind of a simple sounding answer to a simple sounding question, but it's really pretty still complex. So, and I know I'm making it sound like I've got all the answers. I really don't. This is just my answer. I want to make that clear. And I know that, my answer is just a small part of a larger picture, of a larger answer that is out there. And that's okay, though, because it's still Buddhism, and it is still helping us, and it's still helping people. So, taking what you understand about the Dharma and doing as much as you can with it to help those around you is, is okay. It doesn't have to be a full understanding in order for it to be a real practice and to be a real help. So, for me, what I go to as I think about this are the Four Noble Truths. So, when we're talking about experiencing life as it is, unfortunately or fortunately, I guess we don't need to give a value judgment to it, but we all experience suffering and dukkha, or suffering, which is called dukkha, which is really a poor translation for what I kind of think of more as dis-ease, a lack of sense of ease. So it can be, resistance to our current situation. It could be anxiety, it could be anger, it could be sadness, it could be loneliness, it could be fear, or, combination of all those things. But we experience suffering in our lives, and that is true for everybody. The second noble truth is that there is a cause to that suffering, and that's where I think our growth happens when we look at the cause of that suffering. We make it sound so easy or so simple again by saying that, but it's really a little bit more difficult. It runs a little bit deeper than what we think. For example, you might think, in the case of my colleague, well, yeah, of course, there's a cause to my suffering. The admin of my school is being, unreasonable and kind of a jerk and not giving me real answers. But the truth is that that's not the only cause. It might be part of the cause, but it's not the only cause. Most of the time, we also cause our own suffering too. We also hold that mistaken notion that we are individuated, separate beings, and that really kind of is the root of this conflict that we think exists, or that I guess in a phenomenal sense does exist. But we hold that mistaken idea that we are two different people with two different goals and two different ideas and two different, that we're not connected in any way. But the truth is that we are not really separated from each other. The boss may be acting in a way that causes us to feel angry, causes me to feel angry, but I have to look at what am I holding on to that is making me feel this way. And what is the connection between my boss's actions and how I am reacting to it? Because they aren't unrelated and they aren't separate. We're all intrinsically connected. And we have to really take a look at that idea of what's my role in this picture? Where am I in this story that is taking place? There is an analogy about traffic, and we're all getting frustrated about being stuck in traffic, and we forget that we are traffic. We are part of that traffic. So that's what this points to. The cause of suffering is that idea that they're the problem, but we are also in that problem. So that is part of our cause of suffering, or the cause of suffering is that idea that we're separate from each other. The third noble truth is that there is an end to suffering, and that part really has to do with being able to come to terms with the truth of this shunyata, which is that idea that there are no, the non-duality that I just pointed to. And really being able to come to an understanding of the truth of that really helps us come to terms with everything and helps us bring an end to our suffering. Again, sounds easy, right? Shunyata is not easy. It's very hard to understand. And, while I think I have an eye on what that might be and what it is, I still don't think I have a full grasp of what it really is. So that's why I'm still here. And then the path is also what brings us to the how do you practice Buddhism, and it is what helps us bring an end to the suffering. So the path is the practice. So we kind of have come full circle-ish, I guess. And essentially the Eightfold Path is the list of the 8 practices and the 8 ways of living that the Buddha identified as the things that help lead us to enlightenment, which will liberate us from the dukkha and bringing an end to the cause of the suffering, etc. So it's taught in general that the Eightfold Path deals with how we live, think, work, meditate. It's about diligence of practice and study, and what we think and what we say and the jobs we choose to do. And so those to me are really kind of the how to practice Buddhism. But in order to understand how to practice Buddhism, we also need to understand everything else that comes before that, which is the Four Noble Truths and things like shunyata. That was 21 minutes of an explanation of how to practice Buddhism, which started with why I practice and why most people come to this practice in the first place. Thank you. So this was a tough one for me. I was trying to bring into my Dharma talk reference to specific teachings and specific stories that come from Buddhism, so that I am directly tying in what I'm saying with the actual liturgy and teachings. It's something that is not my strongest suit, I don't think, as much as I have studied liturgy. My memory is not always the best, so I kind of have a little bit of a hard time reaching for them. So it was helpful to do this one because it really kind of stuck with the basics, the stuff that I learned years ago that I can point to relatively easily, versus some of the more obscure teachings from Zen and things like that. So I hope that I was also aiming for the structure of ground, I can't remember, ground, body, whatever the 3 things are. See what I mean? I can't remember things. But I was trying to reach for those three things in the Tibetan, I think it's the Tibetan structure of a Dharma talk. So thank you very much for indulging.